Oligarchy is a word with ancient roots, conjuring images of shadowy councils and influential cliques, yet its meaning is both precise and evocative. The term comes directly from the ancient Greek oligarchia, combining oligos meaning few and archo meaning to rule or to command. At its core, oligarchy means rule by the few. This etymological origin conveys not just a sense of numerical scarcity, but also exclusivity and concentration, a government where power is not broadly shared, but held tightly, often behind closed doors. At its most basic, an oligarchy is a form of government where authority rests with a small group of people. These individuals typically share something that sets them apart from the majority. Throughout history, this commonality has often been wealth, but it can also stem from family ties, noble lineage, military power, or religious authority. The crucial element is not the specific criteria by which the group is chosen, but the concentration of power among them, excluding most others. In this way, oligarchy is fundamentally about narrowing political control, funneling influence into the hands of a limited elite. To better understand what oligarchy truly is, it helps to place it alongside other, more familiar forms of governance. In political philosophy, especially as articulated by the Greeks, systems of rule were often classified by the number of people who held power. At one end stands monarchy rule by one, at the other, democracy rule by the many. Oligarchy sits in between, distinct in that it is neither the singular dominance of a monarch nor the broad participation of a democratic citizenry. Instead, it is the sway of a privileged minority. This distinction is significant. Monarchy often relies on claims of divine right or hereditary succession, vesting power in a single figure. Democracy, by contrast, is characterized by widespread participation and a diffusion of authority. Oligarchy is unique in that it is defined not by the virtue or wisdom of its leaders, nor by their sheer number, but by their relative fewness and their ability to exclude. In this sense, it differs from aristocracy as well. While the two can overlap, aristocracy is generally understood as rule by the best, a nobility of birth or virtue. Oligarchy, on the other hand, is simply rule by the few, with no necessary claim to excellence or nobility. The difference is subtle but important. Aristocracies often justify their rule by appealing to qualities like wisdom or lineage, whereas oligarchies may rule simply because they can. The small group at the heart of an oligarchy might be defined by money, making the system a plutocracy, a government by the wealthy. At other times, it could be a network of powerful families, an entrenched military elite, or a cadre of religious leaders. Regardless of the basis for their authority, the defining feature remains the same: a concentration of power and exclusion of the majority from meaningful participation. This pattern has emerged repeatedly throughout history, often after periods of upheaval or economic transformation, when the old order collapses and a new elite rises to fill the vacuum. Oligarchies are characterized by several key features. The most obvious is the concentration of power. In an oligarchic system, decision-making authority is tightly held, rarely shared with those outside the privileged circle. This often leads to limited political pluralism, where alternative viewpoints and competing interests are marginalized or suppressed. Economic elitism is another hallmark. Wealth and power reinforce each other, creating a cycle that is difficult to break. Corruption and nepotism are common, as those in power use their positions to benefit themselves and their associates. The result is often a deeply stratified society, where the gap between rulers and ruled grows ever wider. It is important to note that oligarchy is not merely a theoretical construct. Historical examples abound, from the city-states of ancient Greece to various ruling councils and juntas throughout the centuries. Notably, oligarchies have often surfaced in the aftermath of turmoil or rapid economic change, when new fortunes are made and new alliances formed. In ancient Greece, for example, there was a transition from aristocratic rule based on birth to oligarchic rule based on wealth. The rise of the nouveau riche, those who had recently acquired wealth, challenged the old noble families and created new forms of oligarchic governance. This shift illustrates how the composition of the ruling few can change, even as the structure of exclusion remains. The phenomenon of minority rule, sometimes referred to as minoritarianism, is closely related to oligarchy, but not identical. Minoritarianism broadly refers to any system where a minority governs, but oligarchy specifically implies the concentration of power among a relatively small, cohesive elite. It is also distinct from other forms of minority governance, such as technocracy or meritocracy, where rule might be based on expertise or achievement rather than mere exclusion. One frequent point of confusion is the difference between oligarchy and oligopoly. While the words sound similar and both describe forms of concentration, the former is political and the latter economic. Oligopoly refers to a market structure in which a small number of firms dominate an industry, not a form of government. From a philosophical perspective, the study of oligarchy has deep roots. Early references appear in Greek literature and historical accounts, where thinkers sought to understand the dynamics and dangers of rule by the few. Oligarchy has become a foundational concept in political science, a lens through which scholars analyze the distribution of power and the mechanisms by which elites maintain control. The persistence of oligarchy through different eras and contexts suggests that it is not merely an accident of history, but a recurring pattern in the organization of societies. Whether arising from the ashes of revolution, the disruptions of economic change, or the ambitions of powerful families, oligarchies have left their mark on the political landscape. Their defining trait is not the particular source of their power, be it wealth, birth, or arms, but the fact that the vast majority is excluded from real authority. Yet, even with these clear contours, oligarchy is a complex and evolving phenomenon. It adapts to the circumstances of the time, taking new forms as societies change. Sometimes it is overt and formalized, with clear boundaries and explicit privileges. Other times, it operates behind the scenes, hidden in networks of influence, patronage, and informal alliances. What remains constant is the enduring tension between the few who rule and the many who are ruled. In considering oligarchy, it is tempting to focus on its flaws, the tendency toward corruption, the lack of accountability, the perpetuation of inequality. These are real and persistent problems. But oligarchy also raises fundamental questions about power: who holds it, how it is justified, and what happens when it is concentrated. Philosophers and historians have long debated whether the rule of the few can ever be legitimate, or whether it is inevitably prone to abuse. While the specifics of oligarchic systems differ across time and place, the philosophical foundations remain remarkably consistent. Oligarchy is about exclusion and control, about the dynamics that allow a small group to shape the destinies of the many. To understand it is to grapple with some of the most enduring questions in political philosophy, questions that continue to resonate today. As we move forward exploring the varieties and consequences of oligarchic rule, it is essential to keep these foundational insights in mind. Oligarchy is not just a relic of the past, but a living concept, one that continues to shape the world in ways both visible and hidden. Its study invites us to look beyond the surface, to ask who truly governs, and to consider the costs and consequences of rule by the few. In the vibrant intellectual world of classical Athens, the question of who should rule was not simply a matter of preference or tradition, it was the focus of intense philosophical debate. Plato and Aristotle, two of the greatest minds of their era, turned their attention to the phenomenon of oligarchy, exposing its inner workings and dangers with a clarity that has resonated through the centuries. Their explorations were deeply influenced by the shifting landscape of Greek political life, marked by changes in wealth, social structure, and the ever-present threat of factional conflict. This dynamic environment served as the living laboratory for their analyses. Plato, in his celebrated dialogue The Republic, viewed oligarchy as one stage in a broader cycle of political forms. For him, the defining feature of oligarchy was the elevation of wealth as the sole criterion for political authority. In such a regime, those with riches hold power, while the poor are systematically excluded. Plato was acutely aware of how this dynamic breeds division within society. He describes the oligarchic city as sharply split between rich and poor, each group regarding the other with suspicion and resentment. According to Plato, this division is not merely a social inconvenience, but a source of deep instability. Concentrating power in the hands of a wealthy few breeds envy among the many, making civil strife almost inevitable. As the gap between rich and poor widens, the city becomes increasingly vulnerable to upheaval and, ultimately, collapse. Plato's vision of political decline follows a recognizable pattern. He outlines 5 types of government: aristocracy, timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. Each, in his account, represents either the realization or the corruption of certain ideals. Oligarchy, for Plato, marks a fall from the ideal of aristocracy, a degeneration that occurs when virtue and wisdom are replaced by the pursuit of material wealth. The oligarchic ruling class, focused above all on accumulating and preserving riches, neglects the moral health of the city. Plato warns that this is a recipe for both ethical decay and social unrest. Aristotle, writing a generation later, approached the subject from a somewhat different perspective. In his Politics, he drew a careful distinction between oligarchy and aristocracy. For Aristotle, the key difference lay not just in who ruled, but in the purpose for which they ruled. Aristocracy, in his schema, is government by the virtuous few who govern in the interest of all. Oligarchy, by contrast, is rule by the wealthy few, serving only their own benefit. Aristotle's analysis was grounded in observation. He saw firsthand how the accumulation of wealth could distort the aims of governance. He noted that in oligarchies, laws and institutions are often crafted to protect the privileges of the rich, frequently at the expense of the wider community. One of Aristotle's greatest insights was his recognition of the inherent instability of oligarchic regimes. He observed that whenever political power is concentrated among a small, wealthy elite, the seeds of factionalism are sown. Rivalries arise not only between the few and the many, but also within the ruling elite itself. Each faction competes for advantage, leading to internal divisions that can be as dangerous as any external threat. Aristotle also pointed out how oligarchies often distort the very concept of justice. Rather than serving the common good, laws are twisted to entrench the privileges of the few, deepening social divisions and fueling resentment. Despite their differences in method and temperament, both Plato and Aristotle saw oligarchy as a deviation from the best form of government. Plato's critique is animated by a moral vision. He is concerned with the ethical and psychological consequences of allowing wealth to become the sole standard of merit. He sees oligarchic societies as spiritually impoverished, their rulers increasingly obsessed with money, and their citizens alienated from public life. Aristotle, more empirical and pragmatic, focused on the practical effects of oligarchic rule, the way it gives rise to instability, conflict, and ultimately, the breakdown of civic trust. The historical context of these debates is essential. In the Greek world, the transition from traditional aristocratic rule to oligarchic regimes was often driven by economic change. As commerce and trade flourished, new forms of wealth emerged, bringing with them new elites. These rising powers were not always content to remain in the background. They sought to translate their economic clout into political authority. The result was an ongoing contest between old and new elites, with the broader population often caught in the middle. This dynamic played out in city after city, shaping the very language in which philosophers like Plato and Aristotle discussed politics. Classical thinkers also classified government according to the number of rulers, one, few, or many. Within this tripartite framework, oligarchy and democracy stood as ideological opposites. Where democracy promised a measure of equality and popular participation, oligarchy was seen as exclusionary, favoring the interests of a narrow elite. The tension between these forms was not just academic, it was experienced firsthand by Greek citizens who saw the consequences of both systems in the fortunes of their own communities. Yet oligarchy was not simply a matter of money or numbers. In the ancient world, the concentration of power among the few was often reinforced by networks of kinship, patronage, and social ritual. Families intermarried, formed alliances, and cemented their status through displays of generosity or participation in religious ceremonies. These practices bound the oligarchic elite together, making it difficult for outsiders to penetrate the circle of power. Social rituals, whether lavish banquets or public sacrifices, were not just expressions of wealth, they were tools for maintaining cohesion within the ruling class and signaling their legitimacy to the wider populace. The analyses of Plato and Aristotle, though rooted in the specific circumstances of their time, have shaped later debates about power, justice, and the structure of society. Their critiques of oligarchic rule, its tendency to foster inequality, its distortion of justice, its inherent instability have echoed through the centuries, informing later theories of government and providing a framework for understanding political systems in many different contexts. Yet, for all their rigor, both philosophers recognize the enduring appeal of oligarchy. In societies marked by sharp economic disparities, the temptation for the wealthy to seek political control is ever present. The mechanisms by which elites perpetuate their dominance, through law, custom, and social networks, are remarkably adaptable. Plato and Aristotle were under no illusion that the dangers of oligarchy could be eliminated once and for all. Instead, they offered their readers the tools to recognize and critique such systems, urging vigilance against the concentration of power in the hands of the few. Their legacy is not a simple condemnation, but an invitation to reflect on the perennial questions of political life. Who should rule? By what standards? In whose interest? The answers, as Plato and Aristotle showed, are never straightforward. The debate over oligarchy, begun in the agora of ancient Greece, remains alive wherever questions of power and justice are asked. In tracing the contours of oligarchic rule, these philosophers not only diagnosed the ailments of their own societies, they illuminated the challenges that confront any community grappling with inequality and the pursuit of the common good. When we move from the bustling agora of ancient Greece to the winding corridors of contemporary power, the idea of oligarchy does not simply disappear or remain a relic of history. Instead, it reemerges in new forms, adapted to the complexities of modern states, economies, and institutions. While Plato and Aristotle provided the early language for understanding rule by the few, modern philosophers and political scientists have expanded that vocabulary, seeking to explain why oligarchic tendencies persist even in societies that claim to be democratic or egalitarian. One of the most influential frameworks for understanding this persistence is the iron law of oligarchy, a concept developed by early 20th century sociologist Robert Michels. Michels argued that all complex organizations, regardless of their founding ideals or formal structures, tend to evolve into oligarchies. According to this theory, the pressures of scale and the demands of efficiency require delegating authority to a relatively small group, leaders, specialists, or managers who inevitably become entrenched. Over time, these leaders consolidate power, develop their own interests, and, whether consciously or not, act to preserve their privileged position. The Iron Law suggests that oligarchy is not just a stage in political evolution, but a structural feature of collective human endeavors, from political parties and labor unions to parliaments and corporations. The implications of Michels' theory have echoed through generations of political thought. It raises unsettling questions about the very possibility of genuine democracy. If even the most participatory organizations tend toward oligarchic rule, are democratic ideals doomed to be undermined from within? This tension animates much of contemporary philosophical debate, especially as scholars look beyond the machinery of the state to the broader landscape of power in society. Modern political scientists, such as Benjamin Page and Jeffrey Winters, have taken up the challenge of tracing oligarchic tendencies in contemporary democracies. Their research suggests that oligarchy is not a relic of the past, nor is it confined to autocratic regimes or transitional societies. Instead, they argue, oligarchic structures endure, even thrive within representative democracies, including notably the United States. While formal institutions may guarantee voting rights and procedural equality, the actual distribution of influence remains profoundly skewed. Wealthy individuals and large corporations possess the resources to shape policy, set the public agenda, and, at times, circumvent the checks and balances designed to limit the concentration of power. In the United States, for example, Winters and Page highlight the disproportionate impact of billionaire elites on political campaigns, lobbying efforts, and media narratives. The fusion of wealth and power, they assert, is not merely a matter of campaign finance, but is woven into the fabric of policy-making itself. This assessment echoes the broader observation that, as societies become more economically complex, the levers of influence multiply, yet access to those levers remains tightly controlled. The result is a system where the formal structures of democracy coexist with informal networks of oligarchic power. Contemporary observers have also noted how economic elites, both individuals and corporations, exert control in less visible arenas. The rise of global media conglomerates, the expanding reach of multinational corporations, and the increasing concentration of wealth all contribute to what some describe as a new age of oligarchy. The influence of billionaires on media ownership and content, for instance, shapes public discourse and frames the boundaries of acceptable debate. In this view, oligarchy becomes not just a political phenomenon, but a social and cultural one, shaping the very terms by which societies understand themselves. For many scholars, this fusion of economic and political power is the defining feature of modern oligarchy. The concentration of wealth provides not only material resources, but also access to policy networks, legal expertise, and the ability to set agendas. Critics argue that this dynamic undermines the promise of equal citizenship and distorts democratic processes, as public decisions increasingly reflect the preferences of a narrow elite rather than the broader population. The iron law of oligarchy, however, is not limited to national governments or corporations. It has been observed in organizations of all kinds, labor unions, professional associations, political parties, where leadership becomes entrenched over time. Even groups founded on radical egalitarian principles often find themselves reproducing hierarchies and exclusions. The necessity of coordination, the complexity of modern administration, and the human tendency to defer to expertise all contribute to this outcome. Leaders, once established, tend to surround themselves with loyalists, control the flow of information, and resist challenges to their authority. The cycle is difficult to break, and efforts at reform frequently result in the emergence of new elites rather than a fundamental redistribution of power. These persistent patterns have led some theorists to question whether true democracy is possible at scale. Is oligarchy an inescapable feature of modern representative systems, or can institutional design and civic engagement limit its reach? The debate remains unsettled. Some argue that the best hope lies in strengthening institutions of accountability, independent judiciaries, free media, transparent bureaucracies that can check the excesses of concentrated power. Others call for more radical reforms, such as decentralization, participatory budgeting, or even the dismantling of entrenched hierarchies within organizations. Philosophers continue to grapple with the question of whether democracy and oligarchy are, in practice, two sides of the same coin. Concrete examples from recent history illustrate the adaptability of oligarchic structures. The post-Soviet Russian experience is often cited as a case where, after the collapse of centralized state socialism, a new class of billionaire oligarchs rapidly emerged. These individuals leveraged connections, acquired state assets, and established control over key industries, shaping the trajectory of the Russian state and its economy. Their influence extended well beyond the economic sphere, affecting media, culture, and even foreign policy. Similar patterns, though distinct in their particulars, can be observed in other contexts where rapid economic change opens the door for new elites to capture the instruments of power. The global rise of economic elites is not confined to any one region or system. The concentration of wealth and power among a small group of individuals and corporations is a phenomenon observed in both developed and developing countries. This reality poses significant challenges to traditional models of constitutional design. Philosophers and legal scholars have responded with a range of theoretical proposals. Some conservative models emphasize the need for checks on popular rule, arguing that stable governance requires a degree of elite stewardship. Liberal theorists seek to balance elite influence with robust protections for civil liberties and mechanisms for popular participation. More radical thinkers advocate for constitutional arrangements that actively dismantle entrenched privilege and redistribute power downward. Institutions and practices play a crucial role in either maintaining or challenging oligarchic dominance. Historically, rituals, patronage networks, and control of key resources have helped elites consolidate their position. In the modern era, these mechanisms are supplemented by legal frameworks, regulatory capture, and the subtle shaping of public opinion. Efforts to counter oligarchic influence often focus on transparency, accountability, and the empowerment of marginalized groups. Yet, as critics observe, reforms intended to democratize power can sometimes be co-opted or neutralized by savvy elites who adapt to new rules without relinquishing their core advantages. The evolution of oligarchic rule is deeply intertwined with changes in state-society relations. As societies grow more complex and interconnected, new forms of coordination and cooperation become necessary. Elites emerge not only by seizing opportunities, but also by meeting the functional demands of governance, administration, and organization. This complexity makes it difficult to draw sharp lines between legitimate leadership and illegitimate domination. The boundary between necessary expertise and exclusionary privilege is often blurred, leaving societies to continually renegotiate the terms of authority and participation. Ultimately, the persistence of oligarchy in modern philosophy is not simply nostalgia for lost aristocracies or a lament over democratic shortcomings. It reflects a sober reckoning with the dynamics of power in large, pluralistic societies. The challenge, as contemporary thinkers see it, is to understand the mechanisms by which oligarchies adapt and endure, and to imagine institutions and practices that might check, or even transcend, the iron law that seems to govern them. Whether such efforts can succeed remains an open question, but the philosophical inquiry continues, fueled by the enduring tension between the ideals of equality and the realities of concentrated power. Is it ever justifiable, in moral terms, for a small group to wield outsized influence over the fate of the many? This question has unsettled thinkers for centuries and remains central to philosophical debates about oligarchy. Both critics and defenders grapple with the ethical dimensions of rule by the few, probing its consequences for justice, liberty, and the common good. The conversation is neither simple nor settled. It is marked by recurring anxieties about inequality, corruption, and social stratification, but also by pragmatic arguments in favor of stability and expertise. As we listen in on this debate, we find ourselves confronting profound questions about power and its proper limits. Much of the philosophical critique of oligarchy centers on the theme of inequality. Oligarchy, by its very nature, excludes the majority from meaningful participation in public life. The few who hold power are often connected by wealth, status, or tightly knit networks. This exclusion is not just about who governs, it is also about whose voices are heard, whose interests are served, and whose dignity is recognized. Critics argue that the injustice of oligarchy lies in its entrenchment of privilege, rendering the many invisible. Moral philosophers have long warned that concentrating authority among a select group inevitably leads to a society where rules are written to benefit the powerful, while the needs and aspirations of the wider community are ignored. Perhaps the most persistent ethical concern is the link between oligarchy and corruption. When a small elite controls both economic and political levers, the temptation to use public office for private gain becomes acute. Evidence suggests that corruption and oligarchy often go hand in hand, creating a vicious cycle. Those with wealth use their resources to secure influence, and those with influence create policies that protect and expand their own fortunes. This dynamic fosters extreme disparities of wealth and power and, crucially, undermines the very idea of fairness. The resulting social stratification is not simply an economic fact, but a profound moral hazard, signaling a breakdown in the principle that all individuals deserve equal consideration. In societies where oligarchic structures prevail, opportunities for upward mobility diminish, and those at the top become increasingly insulated from the struggles of the majority. Another recurring critique targets the suppression of liberty under oligarchic rule. When power is concentrated, dissent is often seen as a threat rather than a vital part of healthy public life. The suppression of opposing voices, whether through legal restrictions, economic pressure, or manipulation of public discourse, erodes the space for genuine debate and undermines the freedoms essential to human flourishing. The moral cost is not only the loss of individual liberty, but also the corrosion of civic virtue. A society in which citizens are discouraged from speaking out or participating actively in their own governance becomes, in a very real sense, less just. For these reasons, many philosophers have concluded that oligarchy is fundamentally incompatible with democracy and justice. Oligarchy, in this view, is not merely an alternative form of government, it is a betrayal of the ideal that public power should be exercised for the benefit of all, not just the privileged few. Critics contend that when the interests of the few are prioritized, the common good is inevitably sacrificed. The legitimacy of any regime, they argue, depends on its institutions' ability to represent the interests of the many, ensure accountability, and uphold basic standards of fairness. Yet, despite these formidable criticisms, defenses of oligarchy have also emerged. Some thinkers argue that rule by the few is not always synonymous with injustice or incompetence. They point out that, in certain circumstances, limited oligarchic elements can provide stability and access to expertise that might be hard to achieve in more diffuse or chaotic systems. The argument here is not that oligarchy is ideal, but that it may, at times, be the least bad option, especially where rapid decision-making or technical knowledge is required. This reasoning is deeply controversial, as it risks justifying exclusion on the grounds of efficiency or merit. And yet it continues to surface in debates about institutional design, where the tension between expertise and broad participation is never fully resolved. Contemporary philosophers recognize the dangers of allowing wealth to dictate political power, but they also acknowledge that eradicating oligarchic influence is no simple matter. The task is complicated by the persistence of social hierarchies, which can endure even in societies that have succeeded in reducing economic inequalities. Elites are remarkably adaptable, often finding new ways to maintain their status, whether through control of cultural capital, manipulation of institutional rules, or cultivation of exclusive networks. This persistence raises a difficult question. Is it possible to decouple wealth from power, or will oligarchic tendencies simply resurface in new forms as old privileges are dismantled? Some have proposed institutional reforms designed to limit oligarchic dominance without undermining the basic principles of democracy. The philosophy of limitarianism, for example, suggests that there should be a moral and legal upper bound on individual wealth, not merely to reduce inequality, but to prevent the capture of political institutions by the super-rich. Others advocate for the creation of plebeian institutions, structures explicitly designed to empower ordinary citizens and counterbalance elite influence. These proposals reflect a growing recognition that the dangers of oligarchy cannot be addressed solely by tinkering at the margins. They require a rethinking of the relationship between wealth, status, and political authority. Even so, the debate remains unresolved, with some warning that such reforms risk overreach or unintended consequences, while others insist that bold action is necessary to safeguard the legitimacy of democratic institutions. It is also important to recognize the paradoxical relationship between oligarchs and philosophy itself. Throughout history, philosophical inquiry has often been sponsored, shaped, and disseminated by elites seeking legitimacy for their rule. While philosophy has provided some of the most enduring critiques of oligarchy, it has also, at times, served as a tool for rationalizing and perpetuating elite dominance. This tension invites us to examine the moral responsibilities of theorists and educators, who must be vigilant against becoming mere mouthpieces of power. Philosophers today continue to wrestle with the moral hazards posed by oligarchy, the erosion of civic virtue, the undermining of justice, and the chilling effect on dissent. The persistence of oligarchic dominance, despite repeated efforts at reform, suggests that these dangers are not easily contained. Social hierarchies can outlast even the most ambitious attempts at leveling the economic playing field. In the face of this, some argue that the best we can hope for is the creation of robust institutional safeguards that limit the worst abuses, even if they cannot eliminate oligarchic tendencies entirely. Ultimately, the moral evaluation of oligarchy is a conversation without a final answer. The critiques are powerful. Oligarchy concentrates power, fosters corruption, entrenches inequality, and threatens the liberties that underpin a just society. The defenses, though less celebrated, remind us that the practical demands of governance sometimes lead to uncomfortable compromises and that expertise and stability have their own value. The ongoing philosophical debate reflects the complexity of public life itself, where ideals and realities are always in tension. What remains clear is that the ethical questions raised by oligarchy are not abstract puzzles, but urgent matters that shape the lives of millions. To engage with them honestly is to confront, again and again, the enduring challenge of how to build a society in which power truly serves the many, not merely the few.